I think we all need to take personal responsibility and get out of that McDonald's mindset, where we're going for Umrah and we're going for fillet of fish. So we need to get rid of the fillet of fish aspect of Umrah.
Halal Big Mac, fillet of fish you can have here.
I mean, that's like 20 years ago. Now it's like Shake Shack and all that kind of thing, right? 40 different occasions. You guys might have seen this too. It was kind of going around on WhatsApp. Yeah. I think the main challenge now in Mecca is a spiritual challenge, and it is a challenge, and for the very, very fabric of the city, for the space, for the sacred space of the city. And I think that the other challenge is preserving the diversity of the Meccan landscape that I was talking about.
So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Jazakallah khair for joining us, and assalamu alaikum to Maulana Asim, as ever, and our special guest today, Yahya, who's not quite a doctor yet.
No, not yet, but hopefully soon.
Inshallah soon. And you're currently studying at Cambridge, your PhD at Cambridge, and you're very close to finishing.
Yeah, so I've got a few months to go, but I'm not sure exactly how long I've got to go because of the whole disruption with COVID. A lot of people are going to take a little bit of extra time, just with libraries closed and that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be quite challenging. There's only so much you can find online in terms of digital resources and that kind of thing.
I was going to say, and that's quite interesting from your point. So again, actually, do you want to tell people about, so the idea and the intention for this particular podcast is to talk about the Hajj, which is why you were invited. So your PhD, do you want to tell people about what your PhD is about?
Yeah, sure. So my PhD is on the Hajj, more as an experiential thing. So how the Hajj was experienced, both in terms of the ritual of the Hajj, but also the space in which the Hajj was undertaken. And as we know, we're talking about a very vast history. So I picked a very small window to kind of zoom into and really understand in detail. And that window's the kind of 100 years between 1660 and 1760, which I picked for various reasons. Maybe we don't want to get into that here. I might digress too much. So the title of that thesis is called Sacred Space, Ritual and Religious Experience in the Ottoman Hajj. And the Ottoman Hajj, mainly because the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina were under Ottoman jurisdiction at that time, sometimes more directly than at other times. So there were interesting power dynamics going on all the time between Istanbul and the Sharifs in Mecca, who we can talk about later, but also authorities in Damascus and Cairo as well.
Authorities from like Mamluk authorities, like leftovers from that period.
Yeah, families, important families in Syria and Damascus, who at various times held more power than at other times. In fact, at one time, the actual governor of Damascus jointly held that role with the role of the Amir al-Hajj, which is a very traditional role that was in existence since at least early Islamic history. So at different times there's different dynamics going on there. But broadly speaking, it's a kind of Ottoman territory and a kind of what I would call an Ottoman paradigm, without making it too jargony. But the Hajj is, I think, occurring within what you could call a broad Ottoman paradigm, politically and religiously as well. And especially in terms of the spaces and the way they're being operated. So that's hopefully a question I'll discuss in the PhD as well, that whole term, the Ottoman Hajj.
Just thinking about, I mean, something you've alluded to already is, which everyone's alluding to at the moment, it's just a thing, is obviously the COVID, the pandemic, which has had an impact on the Hajj this year, whereby only, I think, is it only locals that are able to attend the Hajj this year? Is there, just sort of thinking back, I mean, and I suppose there is just generally an inherent, I don't know if there's an inherent danger, but there's there is a danger with the Hajj just because there are so many different people, especially modern times. Is that something that's happened in previous years as well, where there's just been outbreaks of disease, issues and plagues and whatever else that has had a massive impact on the Hajj?
Yes, I think the nature of the Hajj has always been that it's brought together people spread far and wide. And of course, now it's more global than it's ever been. So it's always been at kind of high risk for kind of transmission of disease or plague. Having said that, I don't notice outbreaks that are like too gigantic, if you like, before the 19th century, when we really see the problem of cholera being, and the Hajj being kind of a hotspot for the spread of cholera. And that is actually a time when the Hajj is, in a sense, global, because it's after the advent of steamships, which meant that Eastern pilgrims were coming along on the Hajj much more, especially Indian pilgrims in massive numbers, pilgrims from East Asia, from the Malay countries. And it was also the colonial period. So there were different colonial powers kind of discussing how to deal with the problem. And there was a big kind of conference in the mid-19th century in Istanbul where they discussed, how to deal with the issue. And the British were famously kind of very reluctant to intervene, because for them it meant perhaps kind of risking an uprising among the Indian Muslims if they were seen to be intervening too heavily in the Hajj. So definitely in that 19th century period, cholera is a massive issue, and we have thousands of people suffering from cholera. So, for example, in 1846, there's a death of 15,000 people, and there was the famous yellow wind, which sounds quite offensive, because it was named for the cholera outbreak among pilgrims from Java and Singapore. So in that year, out of about 90,000 pilgrims, 15,000 pilgrims died, and the cholera spread as far as New York. And at that time, cholera would stay around. I don't mean to scare anyone with COVID, but I mean, it was many years these things would last. So, for example, the 1865 outbreak, it only ended in 1874. So definitely you can see the kind of challenges with the Hajj and cholera. And there were kind of quarantines set up, I think just off the Yemeni coast, at the kind of tip of the Red Sea, where pilgrim traffic would be kind of stopped and controlled. So definitely in the sense of plague and disease, the Hajj has always been at risk of that, but also there's been other challenges to do with armed conflict and political disputes as well in the past.
I was just about to come on to that and ask, actually, so when you mention the the steamships and that would allow easy access, would there be some people, I mean, again, I think obviously going back many years, that would certainly have been an issue with bandits on caravan routes and those kind of things, and that would have been probably quite a normal thing. But sort of more recently, would that have been also a challenge, whereby what would the route be from India on those steamships?
So after the advent of steamships, how pilgrims were coming over, do you mean?
Yeah.
So just the route across the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure of the exact route, to be frank. I guess I'd be, what I would say is pre-steamship, it's much more of a challenging route.
Yeah.
Because the Hajj is of course tied to the lunar calendar. So you can't make an annual plan as to what the conditions are going to be at sea. So you always have to plan around the monsoon season and around things like wind direction. So after the advent of steamships, all that becomes a lot easier. But the problem then becomes that because it's much cheaper, and there's also things like foundations to pay for very poor pilgrims to go on the Hajj, these steamships are packed with like 800, 900 pilgrims. And it's literally a case of every single space on that ship would be full, kind of every pilgrim just kind of grabbing a place to sleep, you know.
No social distancing.
Why? Exactly. No social distancing.
That's how the cholera spreads, right?
Exactly. And people were, you know, pointing fingers at the British, you know, and saying, you know, surely you should be policing this a little bit better. In fact, there's a famous event in, I think it was 1880, in the Bay of Bengal, where a ship called the Patna had 953 pilgrims on board, and the white officers thought that it was going to sink, so they just abandoned ship. But thankfully, it didn't. The ship didn't sink, and a few days later, it was found, and it was towed to, I think, the port of Aden. So a kind of yeah, it's a good summary of how things would have been at that time. And also, the British had a monopoly on steamships until till the 1870s, I think, when other authorities were able to kind of muscle in on that business. But
in terms of
this thing comes on with Thomas Cook, who were given
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah.
for a few years by the British sole authority to manage the Hajj. So that's what people were kind of wanting from the British, better management.
But in terms of, like, you spoke about like cholera, and so I'm assuming there were other, like the bubonic plague. I don't know if that affected the Muslim world as much, or other sort of Spanish flu or whatever. Was there ever a case of the Hajj ever being closed down? Like, nobody's entering the Haram this year, the Hajj is not taking place in its entirety.
This is a good question. I mean, I saw a document right when COVID was starting, must have been about 3 months ago now, of 40 different occasions. You guys might have seen this too. It was kind of going around on WhatsApp, which is never a good sign. 40 occasions when the Hajj either stopped or they had very, very low numbers. And then more recently, there's been a kind of list of 10 different occasions. And in both cases, there's no sources for that. But the information from that earlier document of 40 occasions has kind of filtered out into various different news articles, those fancy news videos that get made these days. Even an academic article, I saw someone, not an academic article, but an article written by an academic, where I thought, this seems vaguely familiar. So you can get away with that. Someone's written that document in Arabic, and they just basically translated it, and then you don't have to cite the person and hope for the best. So again, lack of footnotes always makes me a bit suspicious. But on the few occasions that I can comment on, the Paramita is a very famous one. So we're talking about this sect who wanted to establish a khilafah in the name of the seventh Imam.
So the Shia sect.
Yeah, so a kind of heterodox Shia sect. And they attracted a lot of Bedouin followers from northeastern Arabia and the Syrian desert. And they were very brutal, kind of fast-moving, very efficient across the terrain that they were masters of. And in their brutality, I think another modern phenomenon we can kind of see in them is probably ISIS and the way they operate. A definite kind of, putting it this way is a bit crass, Khawarij vibes, if you like.
Everybody is going to hell apart from us.
Yeah, so I think they even saw the Hajj as a sort of paganistic ritual.
Oh, wow.
I'm sure as to the exact theology of this. But again, I'm wary of saying too much based on, in the absence of this kind of reliable information. But what we know for sure is that from about 916, they start to interrupt the Hajj route, from Iraq, the Darb Zubaydah, which we can talk about, and I'm sure we'll talk about. And they kill all the male pilgrims and enslave the female pilgrims. And then later on in 930, they raid Mecca itself, and they slaughter pilgrims in the Haram. and they desecrate the well of Zamzam by throwing the corpses in there. And then very famously, they take the Hajar al-Aswad back to their base in Eastern Arabia. And as far as I know, they were inviting people to come and do pilgrimage around that stone, which the Abbasids, the power of that time, were only able to get back for a massive ransom in 952. So you can.
And they didn't get. Did they get the full stone back, or is that the pieces now that we have? Because I swear there's some in Istanbul, there's certain masajid you can find little traces of the Hajar al-Aswad.
Yeah. So with the question of Istanbul, I'm not sure how those stones came to be in Istanbul. I have looked into it a little bit. So
also how authentic that is as well, how authentic they are.
Yeah.
So apparently there's 6 in Istanbul. There's 4 in the mosque of Sakollu Mehmet Pasha, which is nowadays, if you were to go to Blue Mosque, you should go there. I mean, it's a very nice mosque.
Well, not right now. I mean, you can't go right now.
You could. Turkey's open.
Oh, is it? SubhanAllah, okay.
I don't advise anyone to go until it's safe. There's 4 pieces in there. Apparently, there's one in the Blue Mosque, but I've never seen it, and I've looked for it. And I've asked the Imam, and he kind of very grumpily told me, La yujad. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to ask you anymore. And then there's one kind of embedded into the tomb of Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman Kanuni. His tomb is just part of his, just outside his mosque, so part of that complex. And I'm inclined to think that they're genuine simply because there were a lot of repairs going on at that time. The Kaaba was structurally weak. So in Suleiman's time, the wall was strengthened, braces were put in. So it's entirely possible that fragments had fallen off. Maybe they were kind of, well, as Sheikh Asim alluded to, it was more fragments, right, of the stone. So it's entirely possible that a fragment could come off and then be sent over. So Sakollu Mehmet Pasha was a Grand Vizier, and he would have been one of the people overseeing repairs in the haramain. So again, very much conceivable that they could be genuine, but equally possible that they're not genuine. So unless someone discovers a document in the government archives to confirm the specific process by which the stones were sent over, I don't think we'd be able to authenticate it. But nor do I think it was part of the early 20th century movement of relics from the haramain to Istanbul. I don't think it was part of that, because I have found a source from the 18th century, very interesting personality called Hafiz Ayvansaray, wrote a book called Hadiqatul Jawami', so Gardens of the Mosques. And he kind of categorized all the mosques in Istanbul, and he mentions that there's a piece of the Hajar al-Aswad in Sakollu Mehmet Pasha Mosque. So we know it was there at that time, which actually does make me kind of inclined to think it might have been genuine, but Allahu A'lam.
In terms of the karamita, like you mentioned, so there's always been this sort of significance or importance of the control of the haramain and the legitimacy it gives you. And that a lot of Muslim rulers have always sort of aspired towards that we are the Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, the announcements we've made, whether that's the Sharif or whether that's whoever that was. But at the same time, how much legitimacy would that carry for them? Because I was thinking recently, because I don't know if you saw, the big debate over 20 versus 8 rak'ah tarawih. That's always been like the perennial issue in every Hanafi mosque in the UK. And one of the evidences they always put, well, in the Haramain is 20, so that's, we proved them wrong. And then this year, I think they announced they were going to do 10, and it was like, oh, the argument no longer works.
Yeah, I mean, I find the same phenomenon in the question of moon sighting, so which is another very controversial issue of our times, and people appeal to the Haramain as a source of authority on that front as well, which has arguably shaky foundations in
we're local moon sighters, so we will.
So did you do it? What day did you do it this year? Was it Sunday or Monday this year?
Sunday.
Sunday. So you did
it. Eid al-Fitr was Sunday.
Right. Okay.
I think.
So this year I think was good because we had mostly united Eid, I think. Anyways,
Yes.
massive digression. Where were we?
The authority of the haramain.
Yes, exactly. Let's stick to that. I mean, Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, there's a famous account where Sultan Selim has, he's just finished conquering the Mamluks in 1517, and he's in Aleppo, so he might have been in 1516, and he's described as Hakim al-Haramain al-Sharifain or something like that, and then he corrects the preacher and says, no, I am Khadim, I'm servant of the blessed sanctuaries, the noble sanctuaries. How accurate that anecdote is, I'm not sure, because I've also read that the title goes back to Salahuddin, and we know now the title is in full effect with the Saud family. What you can definitely say is that it's a very, very powerful title from among the different titles, for example, that the Ottoman sultans would have employed. So if we look at authority as a collection of symbols and a collection of titles, then the Haramain is both a powerful title, being Khadim al-Haramain, and as a symbol, being having Mecca from among your sovereign territories is a very, very powerful thing. And having the Hajj as something that you are responsible for organizing and serving the pilgrims is a very, very powerful thing. I actually forget what your question was. We were talking about...
In terms of like, I'm just thinking now, because I remember when I was in Turkey, I was in Istanbul, and one of the brothers said, oh, may Allah, I'm just quoting what was said to me. One of the Turkish brothers said words to the effect like, the Haramain Sharifain, which are now under Wahhabi occupation, may Allah, because they're Turks, and that was their authority once upon for a very long period of time. So in terms of, and we know that the Fatimids, I think, had control of the Haramain for a period of time. You mentioned the Qaramita managed to come in, so heterodox Shia groups that were very dodgy theologically, who definitely could not use that as a point of legitimacy because their theology was so far-fetched. And then you have even like early Umayyads who had problems, uprisings that happened against them. So how would the traditional Muslims see that? Because now everybody's pointing to them as a finger of authority, but does it really carry that legitimacy, at least in pre-modern times?
I think even in pre-Islamic times, you could say. So the Prophet's ancestor, Qusay ibn Kilab, he was the one who established important offices that were very, very closely linked to the Hajj. So we know about Siqaya, which is the responsibility of providing water for the pilgrims, Rifada, which is the responsibility of providing food for pilgrims, Hijaba, which is the guardianship of the Kaaba. We also know about the Dar al-Nadwa, so the kind of office where political
parliament
is discussed, kind of parliament. So even from that time, the Hajj, the idea of organizing, of serving pilgrims is of political importance, and there's no doubt about that. And in early Islam, with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then the first caliphs, the religious and the political office of the Khalif kind of combines in the Hajj, and there's no kind of boundary between that. And even when Ali radiallahu anh has to move his base over to Iraq, he's still sending people over. And the reason he's doing that is to make sure that the Hajj is organized safely and securely. So those offices are very, very important. And then under the Umayyads as well, as you alluded to, Mecca becomes a kind of base of resistance, especially under Ibn Zubayr, right? So it's a very, very powerful symbol politically in that respect. And when the Umayyads are able to reassert control in the Haramain, then they're very careful about asserting that hegemony over that territory, and it's a very powerful symbol of their authority. And same with the Abbasids, and when the Abbasids are no longer able to look after the Hajj as they can, it has very, very powerful ramifications, significant ramifications for their own legitimacy, but also for the actual condition on the ground. So it's no surprise then that when Salahuddin is able to restore kind of security and stability in the haramain, that he makes use of this title of Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, and similarly with the Mamluks, and then with the Ottomans. So, I mean, I did say it was a very vast history, but the way I've kind of squeezed it all together there.
I think we're done there, so it's been nice having you on.
Yeah, okay. Salam. Yeah.
But those momentary blips, how would they see those? Like, would that be seen as like some sort of divine punishment that's come upon them for misdeeds that they've committed, that Allah has taken us control of the haramain away from us?
I think this is a big question. How should we interpret these things theologically? Because we know in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن أول بيت وضع للناس للذي ببكة مبارك وهدى للعالمين فيه آيات بينات مقام إبراهيم ومن دخله كان آمنا, and the sense of it being a sanctuary and a protected place. But we also see that Mecca is very much, just as any other place, subject to both man-made and divine tests. Things like even in the Ottoman period, just off the top of my head, around I think 1640 or so, some rebels came into Mecca and they massacred a whole bunch of pilgrims within the Haram itself. And so then you get famous jurists like Hassan al-Shurambulali and another jurist by the name of Nuh bin Mustafa, less well known, having to write fatwa legitimizing or permitting the Ottomans to go in then to Mecca and to by force deal with those rebels. So
very similar to the 1979 siege of Mecca.
Exactly, the parallels are uncanny, really. So that fatwa at that time was called السيف المجزم لقتال من هتك حرمة الحرم المكرم. So without, not a literal translation, but legitimizing the killing of those who have violated the sanctuary of Mecca, which itself is supposed to be a sanctuary, of course, and there's specific rules. You can't even chop down trees. Okay, so when we talk about human life, of course, we know what the Prophet said about the sanctity of human life above that of the sanctity of the Kaaba even. So when we look at things like that happening, what like the Paramita did, when people are being, when the sanctity of human life is being violated in the very vicinity of the Kaaba, that's a great theological question that I think contemporary scholars should think about, along with questions like why do we have to deal with COVID, and how should we think about that theologically as well.
Just thinking about that, so in that example that you gave, where people were killed within the Kaaba vicinity, what was the kind of what was the, I suppose, the political fallout as a result of that? So, you know, obviously now, you know, you've had a whole group of ulama and scholars who have had to make a decision or, you know, release a fatwa around this. And we had a similar situation, like, you know, you kind of mentioned the siege of Mecca. And it was almost that, from my understanding of the book, when I read that a while back, was actually the screws were tightened even more almost after the siege in 79. And it was made kind of even more, it was almost more one directional in terms of the religious authority there.
What you're trying to say there is there's like they acquiesced to the rebels' demands in a
sense.
Yeah,
they almost did.
So to not let it happen again. So who were the rebels in the Ottoman time, and what were their demands when they did that?
I wish I'd read out better on this particular event now, but I seem to recall there were rebels from Yemen with some sort of political dispute, some sort of issues that they had, and an army was sent from Egypt to deal with them. But unfortunately, I can't really recall much more than that off the top of my head. But the
When
reason about
It,
it,
it was much more political. I mean, I suppose it's all kind of, all brings it in, all political, religious.
yeah, the siege of Mecca was really a kind of mishmash of political, or I guess you could say religio-political
man,
issues, and I think this was much more political from what I remember.
So it's less so. I'm the Mehdi, and I'm ready to bring the to bring the new way.
Fury of the heavens.
Exactly.
I don't think that happens until the first Wahhabi.
I wanted to come to that actually.
Yeah, the first Wahhabi kind of
Occupation.
occupation. Occupation. We're using the brother from Turkey's words, but yeah, the first one you could for sure call an occupation, because at that time it's the Ottomans who are in charge, and we see the involvement of Egypt there. So the Ottomans have to ask the then Khedive of Egypt, who is Muhammad Ali, for help in removing the Wahhabis, which they do. So
one of the things about the Wahhabis, I mean, just to stay on that sort of point, the early Wahhabi movement is there's a lot of, I think from where we come from in terms of our religious background, they're always seen as, they came in, destroyed all the relics, destroyed all the masajid, destroyed, the graves of the Sahaba, Jannatul Baqi, and etc., etc. And we see obviously the consequences of that now when you go, that, just the stones and stuff. But before we even go to that, it's like, one of the things I saw about the Wahhabis is many people were so praiseworthy of them that they finally brought security to the haram. That there'd been so much, the Sharif was there, extortionate taxation. He's rinsing everybody that came in, lining his pockets. Then the Wahhabis came in and they were just like, everybody's like, oh, well, the organization is really good.
Yeah. I mean, certainly on the second occasion. So I was alluding to the early or the late 18th century occupation. What was it? It was 18.
That's a grandson, right? Abdullah bin something.
So and this period in the 20th century, there is a sense of that, in the sense that he's able to really deal with the Bedouin problem. Really about Mecca's conquered, for example, in 1924, and then later on there's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia kind of proclaimed, and then you see just before that's the end of the Sharif family and their rule in Mecca after a very, very long time. But what people forget is that, as Brother Asim and Asim M, Asim A were talking about just before the podcast, was there's actually a time without oil. So oil is struck in 1938, and that's when we really see Hajj facilities improve. And there were quite oppressive taxes up until that point being imposed by the Saudis.
Okay.
It might sound familiar to us, but being imposed on the Hujjaj at that time. And then with the advent of oil, a lot of burden is taken off from the Hujjaj, and then that improves how things are going. But there's no doubt, even before oil is struck, Ibn Saud is able to deal quite well with the Bedouin. So he either co-opts them, and if they're not co-opted, then he deals with them very, very brutally. And because he's able to level more with them, he's not a kind of distant power from Istanbul who's just going to be concerned with trying to deal with it politically or just trying to pay you off. And one of the two, he's kind of either he co-opts them and makes them help out in the Hajj, or he kind of so it's either what do you call it, stick or what's that?
Carrot.
Carrot. Yeah. So
because traditionally
that works for him.
Because they used to bribe the Bedouins, right? So these Bedouin tribes that you had to go through, because the route was so dangerous around that area, that you'd end up having to pay big amounts for them to watch over your caravan as you went through.
One man's bribe is another man's subsidy. So it depends how you want to read that, really. But for sure, I mean, that was the Ottoman tactic, which is they'd have a register and they would pay each tribe or each Bedouin confederation a certain amount to kind of guarantee security. But with the Ibn Saud in those initial years, I think he did struggle without that, without those Ottoman subsidies. And I think this is why he had to resort to taxes. And although the destruction of the Hijaz Railway might have helped in the long run for him to attain power, but having the absence of that link, of that rail link from Damascus to Medina, I think actually would have caused him harm at that time. And don't forget, this is still before air travel. So I think, so I think it would have been a difficult time for the Hajj in those initial years.
Would you mind elaborating? I mean, I think that's an interesting segue to make to the Hijaz Railway and what its function, and Sultan Abdul Hamid maybe more specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, there's different, even though the Hijaz Railway isn't in operation for a long time, I think it definitely is something that's remembered mostly fondly now by Muslims, sometimes even romantically. But I think when I reflect on it now, again, these are my personal reflections. I think it seems really practical to have more railways used in and around those areas, especially Arabian Peninsula, and with the effect of air travel on the environment. I think, so what if it takes a longer time to travel by rail? But I think that's something that should be reintroduced. But moving beyond the environment, Hijaz Railway, so there's definite religious reasons for it, to facilitate Hajj travel in a time where the land route was being used less and less, and there were issues with piracy on the Red Sea as well. So the sea route has its challenges. The Bedouin are just as aggressive as ever. So we talked about the Bedouin in the early Saud period. So you can tell they're kind of perennial problem, especially the Bedouin of the Hijaz and of southern Syria. So I think it was about in 1900 or so that Abdul Hamid II begins work on that, and they finish and they reach Medina in 1908. And there was plans also to do another railway from Berlin to Baghdad. So, and then who knows where else they might have gone to. So there could have been a really good little network there to help people go on the Hajj. But also, of course, the political motivations. So the Ottomans would have easily been able to maintain a troop presence in the Hijaz with that railway. And I think the British and then later on the Bedouin who helped them blow up the railway were well aware of that. And the war, certainly they anticipated the war. And with the British kind of base in Egypt, it was a good insurance system to have that railway there so that they could defend the Hijaz and also southern Syria in the case that a war broke out. And also the Wahhabis in Najd were kind of a resurgent power by that point after they'd been dealt with about 100 years earlier. So in terms of security, very important. In terms of transporting Hajj, very important as well.
How true is the story about when the Wahhabis come back and I can't remember, but the story that when it all kicked off again, and I can't remember the name of the Pasha who fought to defending the haramain. What was his name?
In Medina, Fakhruddin Pasha.
Yeah, and then he sort of quickly gets all the relics, puts them on a train, and gets them to Istanbul as fast as possible. I mean, is there any truth to that story? I mean,
this is a good question. I think it's blew up a couple of years back. Some comments
because there were political comments between the Gulf Arabs
Erdogan and a minister from the Emirates or somewhere. Again, because of the political relevance of this issue, it's always hard to get to the truth. And I think the
It's a
Arabs
brilliant soundbite.
have a particular name for this whole process by which the relics were transported back to Istanbul. And if you go to Topkapi, you can Topkapi Palace today, or Topkapı if you want to pronounce it properly. I got corrected for that once when I was in Turkey, so I should say it properly. You can see the relics are there. Many relics which would have been previously present in Medina, for example. Although actually there's another story from a time, I forget which Saudi ruler it was, and whether it was in that first Saudi period or the second. I think it was in the first Saudi period, where actually they had to sell off a lot of those relics from the Rawda and from the Hujra. So a lot of relics and treasures were stored inside the Hujra, so the Hujra of the Prophet ﷺ. And because of the economic problems they had at that time, the scarcity of finances, the Saudi ruler in Mecca had to actually sell off a lot of that, and it was a massive controversy.
To who did they sell it to, or who bought it, should I say?
Again, you're just giving me loads of ideas for things to look into here.
I mean, that's the thing. You just wonder. I mean, again, in my mind, I'm just thinking about that whole sort of thing about colonialism, and then when the Brits take stuff or borrowed things or whatever it is, and then it's just kind of found 100 years later, kicking about in some museum drawer somewhere.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if maybe it's a similar sort of thing. Maybe it's all in the British Museum somewhere.
For sure, that's a possibility. I wouldn't count against it.
When the Saudis take over, because I used to go to the Rawda and stuff, and you can see poetry that's from a very Ottoman theology. You can see, if you go to Makkah Mukarramah, certain masajid have the turba of an Ottoman sultan. How much of it was, because obviously there are theological reasons for why they demolished a lot of the things they did, but how much of it was political, like we need to assert our own identity upon the haram that's not linked to that previous Turkish, because they would refer to it as a Turkish occupation.
But also how much of it is practical, in that they needed to expand and build more.
Okay, that's a good
those are all $1 million questions, really, and together big $3 million question. I mean, if we look at, for example, the haram itself, so the area around the Kaaba, I think whatever power would have been in place in the Hijaz after the advent of air travel, they would have had to remove, for example, the maqams, because it's just the amount of pilgrims now that are performing tawaf is just, and this is why they've had to expand the mataf area. And also the Zamzam well, I don't know how another political authority would have dealt with that, with the challenges of having physical Zamzam present, access to the Zamzam well open in the haram. And also before, the Maqam Ibrahim was not like a small dome structure as it is now, it was a much larger structure. So I think those are the structures that you're alluding to, right? So the Maqam of the Hanafis and the Shafi'is, the Malikis and the Hanbalis, the Zamzam well, the Maqam of Ibrahim, which I've explained was a bigger structure. So all those things, and also the mataf, so the area in which the tawaf is performed was kind of marked at different periods by kind of, I think in the images you see from 1880 onwards, they kind of like, there's posts there, and then there's a kind of an arch which you enter the area of tawaf, and that arch is called the Bab Beni Shayba, and that's been there for a long time. That had been there for a very long time. So to get rid of all of that is for sure, I think, unavoidable. But of course, it's the manner of how you do it as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that can be categorized under a case of dealing with greater pilgrim traffic, but then also needing to be done in a tasteful way and taking into account the kind of standards about conservation and so on. And then in terms of architecture and those kinds of issues, I think there's a very clear Saudi aesthetic which emerges. So when new doorways are built, all the other doorways were kind of also adjusted. And you can clearly make the argument that, well, we need to maintain one aesthetic, you know, in the building. But there's also very, very clear implications about erasing the previous aesthetic, which was not only Ottoman, but would have had, you know, massive influences from the Mamluks as well, and maybe even Abbasids and perhaps even Ayyubids as well.
And I think we have to be practical about it. And I think it's really easy to be emotional, and really attached to some of those things. But again, talking about those relics, what is the alternative to the well of Zamzam, for example?
Yeah, I mean,
that's a very quick example. I went to Hajj, and we talked. I mentioned this. So when I went to Hajj about 12 odd years ago now, the well of Zamzam was closed. And I think this, and I'm only using this example because this is the example of, this is just the practicalities on the ground. There were the cleaners, and they were coming to clean the Dwaf area, and had this massive, it was almost like a trolley. It was huge, full of water, and that's the water they were using to clean. It's obviously got disinfectant in it, bleach in it, and whatever else. And I just remember seeing someone just beeline for it, just absolutely run, and he dived in, and it's this massive. I think the only way that I can describe it is like it was almost an industrial-sized bin. There's like industrial bins that you have, and then it's just full of water, and the guy just jumped in, and it was just actually, and that really made me sort of think. I was like, subhanAllah, imagine just 100,000 people trying to do that into the well of Zamzam, because he obviously thought it was, Zamzam water.
But did he jump into the bleach?
No, he jumped into the bleach. He jumped into the, the bleach, or the disinfectant water that they were using to clean. And then obviously, I can't say where he was from, but he was, and that's just, again, a practical example of things that needed to be changed. And if I could just go back, actually, something that you mentioned earlier as well, see the Yahya, when you talked about oil money that came in, and the blessing of that, because and the practicalities and the efficiency needed to go through, because there've been occasions where, especially during the stoning, when it was just a pillar, and it had to, and there were loads of people that died, stampedes and those kind of things, and now it's a massive thing. And then you often hear people, mashallah, the uncles, when they're sitting around, they say, subhanallah, look at the shaitan, he's got massive, and you're just like, yeah, but it's practical. It's a practical thing that has to be done. Otherwise, people will die. There will be stampede. And now, especially when there's millions of people that are going.
I think where it's easy to look back. But I think initially, after people started flying into the Hajj, and that began in the 1950s. And there were pilgrims coming in from India and from Turkey, Iran, from Nigeria, from Bangladesh. So just massive amounts of pilgrims coming over from these places. And
massive. When you say massive amounts of people, what kind of numbers are we looking at?
For example, in 1961, and the first plane came in 1953. And actually, I have this is from 1953. This magazine here, Geographic. If you see those pictures floating around, none of them are ever cited, by the way, but they're from this magazine, the 1953 pictures, where this brother by the name of Abdul Ghafur Sheikh, I assume, rahimahullah, 1953, a long time ago. He actually was one of the first to fly in, and then he did a massive article with the National Geographic about that. So 1961, we have about 290,000 pilgrims. And then about 10 years later, 1972, 450,000 pilgrims. So you can see that the logistical challenge of that is massive. There would have been a small airport at that time. And if you think about the requirements of administering a pilgrimage involving that many people, moving people around, keeping them safe, keeping them healthy, making sure all these people who speak different languages are informed about the conventions, things that need to be done, where they need to be moving, how they need to be moving, even organizing the sacrifice for that number of people. Undoubtedly, it's a challenge, and that's what motivated those initial, what we're talking about, the renovations of the haram and the outer haram and the expansion. So in those expansions under King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, for example, the Mas'a, so the area of the Sa'i, is paved, and then the two lanes are separated. There were houses on each side of the Mas'a, those were demolished. So again, a kind of necessary demolition. And the actual area of the haram is expanded from about 29,000 square meters to about 160,000. So you can see it's a kind of massive expansion. And also there's a supreme Hajj committees established in 1966. So like the mayor of Mecca, the mayor of Jeddah, health minister, there's a Hajj minister, people from transport, and they're kind of trying to oversee this big thing. And they started using computer technologies to kind of for crowd management and that kind of thing. They have like a mutawif system that we know very well, and UK agents normally work very closely with the mutawifs to organize the Hajj. So all those logistics we are very much with us today. So because the Saudis, of course, still administering the Hajj. But returning back to the original point about people dying in the Jamarat, about the necessary, arguably necessary expansions in the Haram, I think things just happened too quickly. When I personally look back at the history, I think the rise in pilgrim numbers, as far as I know, the Saudis were trying to put controls on, and they initially had trouble putting a quota on Hajj pilgrims, which is, of course, in place now in Muslim majority countries. I think it's 1 in 100, which is a quota. So, for example, if you're in Egypt or another Muslim country. And by the way, when they did that, it actually really changed the Hajj, because before they were having people from mainly Arab-speaking countries, because they're the closest countries. So it was kind of easier for them to come. But then when they put that quota system in place, it became a question of the more Muslim citizens you have, the more quota you get, right? So
all the Indonesians.
Sorry?
Loads of Indonesians suddenly.
Exactly, yeah. Malaysians and Indonesians,
Indians.
Pakistan, India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, even Turkey. All these countries have more in Muslim inhabitants than many of those Arab-speaking countries. So it actually makes it quite international and gives the Hajj more of an international feel again.
In terms of the evolution of the Hajj, so obviously one of the big gripes people have of the modern Hajj is because of, and it's the problem people have with modern globalization, global capitalism, when suddenly you have an influx of that many people, 3 million pilgrims, or you could say 3 million consumers have suddenly arrived in the Haram. McDonald's suddenly, gets a bit excited and thinks, oh, okay, now that's, and a moment for me now to, indulge these people. And then all of this suddenly, there's that famous statement, people say, oh, there's only, Mecca, the city that never sleeps. But I just remember that's Las Vegas. That's the city that never sleeps. So when you go there and the big lights and the massive hotels, and you go there and it's like, is it like a tribute to the monotheism of Ibrahim alayhi salam, or a tribute to 21st century Western capitalism that's going on there? And I think that's a lot of people, the spirituality of the Hajj, they've seen it really be sort of sucked out So I know this is like a massive area that we can expand on. But if you read like Ibn Jubair, Ibn Battuta, their reports of the Hajj, the amount of people, you could, kissing the Hajar Aswad, I assume was a simple thing that anybody would be able to do once upon a time. Now you go, unless you've got like 3 black belts and, you're still, you need an army behind you to get in, or unless you're like some famous Arab politician or singer or something, then they'll let you in as well, or whatever. So, but what's that been in terms of like this massive evolution of the Hajj, the expansion, and then just something to an extent, the horrific consequences that is brought of demolition, mountains being destroyed, etc., erosion of loads of areas because so many people are walking on top of them. Jabal Rahma, when we went, I remember, Asim, I remember this, we were told by our group that don't go and climb that because we want future generations to be able to climb that or see that at the very least. Because if everybody keeps going on it, it's going to go smaller and smaller. So this is so open-ended, but I'd love to get your thoughts and maybe some sort of...
As well. I think one of the other things is actually when you were reading the books, I think before I went to Hajj, and as I say, it was about 12 years ago now, so I was reading the books and you were just like, right, you've got to go, you've got to do the Tawaf, and then you've got to do the Say between the Mount Safa and Mount Marwa, and you're like, right, okay, I'm looking out for these mountains, and then when you get there, you're just like, that's not a mountain, that's barely a staircase, and then it is that thing of actually, so we were told actually when we went, Mount Uhud, we were told not to climb because it had been completely eroded, and it was all the stone had turned to sand, and people were just saying actually probably won't last very much longer. And I certainly remember going back when I went, the mountains were being demolished. There was dynamite and blown up mountains and all the rest of it. So, and it's continued to expand. The expansion is massive at the moment, and it will continue to do so, I'd imagine.
Well, this is the age-old question about conservation and about refurbishing and renewing buildings and monuments, and what principles should govern that. And I think that is a very legitimate channel from which one can criticize the Saudis, because we were talking about how some things are undoubtedly necessary, but there are many, many things which seem unnecessary. There seems to be mismanagement in some regard, a lack of sensitivity. I mean, historically speaking, the landscape of Mecca was a very, very diverse one, as we know very well. You've mentioned mountains like Abu Qubais, Hira, Khandama, Thawr, Thabir. We have birthplaces, so the birthplace of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Mawlid of Fatima radiallahu anha. By Mawlid, I mean physical, meaning in the location sense, not the time sense. So the birthplaces, so the Mawlid of Fatima, which is also the home of Khadija radiallahu anha, where the Prophet ﷺ lived with her. The Mawlid of Ali and the other Khalifs, the Mawlid of Hamza, Prophet's uncle, peace be upon him, and the home of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So I could go on, and then of course there's graves as well, the tombs of different personalities, and also other places which the Prophet spent time in. So we have a diverse landscape, right? And it was a job of successive powers to maintain that. And for the most part, they were able to maintain most of it. Even though I see in sources from the Ottoman time where a scholar might say, well, this place is in disrepair. Even the area of Tan'im, Masjid Aisha, I saw a 16th century scholar say, well, at the moment, it's not in a good state. And one of the rulers should come and refurbish this place. So that's kind of, as I said, it's an age-old issue of maintaining these places. But when you're kind of changing the landscape of any place, you need to be sensitive to the local culture and the local history. Combining with multinational corporations to bring change to Mecca was and is a move which will which will and has really brought sadness and I think and distress to the hearts of Muslims. I think there's no doubt about that. I think when the Quran says talks about the idea of Mecca as a sanctuary, I think in the modern day, where for the most part there isn't a massive security issue as there was in the past with things like Bedouin challenges and other things like the Qaramita popping up. I think the main challenge now in Mecca is a spiritual challenge, and it is a challenge, and for the very fabric of the city, for the space, for the sacred space of the city. And I think that the other challenge is preserving the diversity of the Meccan landscape that I was talking about. And those are two things that I think are the priority right now. And I hate to say this, but part of Vision 2030 is to up pilgrim numbers up to 6 million. I'm not talking about Umrah, I'm talking about Hajj. And then to have 24 million annual Umrah pilgrims. So that's obviously year round. So altogether 30 million Hajj. And that brings me back to the point about things moving too fast, which you couldn't blame anyone for. But surely now is the time to slow things down and to try and reflect about the future of both holy cities and to think about how to preserve their fabric.
One of the thing you mentioned, I remember, because when you read the early Hajj accounts, you see this idea of the difficulty of the journey, always being in movement, in flux, being on your toes. Your camel might just run off. The donkey that you've got might do this. Maybe you don't even have a camel or donkey. You've walked it all the way from wherever you've come from. You struggled this long journey, the dangers, the attacks of the caravans. Maybe you came in Crusader periods where you had, Crusader knights attacking caravans and things like that. You make this incredibly difficult journey to get to the haram, which we don't have anymore. That whole idea of the Hajj as this incredible enterprise of sacrifice that you have to make doesn't exist. And a lot of it doesn't exist in terms of a lot of pre-modern ideas that we used to have. The pre-modern Muslim just sort of doesn't exist anymore because he doesn't have those things that make him what he was. The sort of furnace in which he was developed. But at the same time, I remember reading somewhere that what was that? That's just just doing one tawaf is that now. You're taking that that long 4 months journey of difficulty, whatever it was, and that's just been made in the size of the crowd has suddenly made that the difficulty carrying out the Hajj itself. And that point you made, is a beautiful point. The idea that you made is a spiritual crisis. I think some of it is just trying to find spirituality in there, even though it is the hub of the spirit, our spiritual existence. I mean, Ibn Qayyim's got this beautiful statement he makes. It's like the qayyam, it is the pole of the universe, is the Kaaba itself. And as it stands firm, the whole world will stand firm. And it sounds like a beautiful point, but then you go there and you just think, where is? I remember me and Asim had this conversation there. It's like, where do you find? Where's the moments? Where's those grand moments? Where Arafah people crying tears and stuff, and you're just trying to make it happen, but it's very hard to sort of bring, I don't know, like wood to life. It's a very difficult experience. And then the Meccan landscape thing. Okay, but the Meccan landscape thing. Also, the diversity thing, the loss of diversity has been bigger. Like Ibn Battuta, I think, mentions the four niches for each of the four madhabs, the Ottoman scholars who would teach and study in the haram, all these grand schools that we had of theological diversity, where, I mean, the Shafis and Hanafis have had their beef, but there was later at least some sort of peaceful coexistence that would take place. That's gone now as well. There's like a forced Saudi Islam that everybody has to sort of toe that line and stuff at the same time. So I like one of the questions, and I feel like you could expand on any of these points. What happens to the indigenous population? Like, there's been families that lived in Mecca for centuries, from maybe even the time of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam till today, and the flux that they've seen throughout their lives. Are their families still with that historical sort of authenticity that still exists at that point? And at the same time, how do you think they've seen all this change that's happened in their city?
So there was a few points in there. If we start with a longue durée look at the history of the Hajj from the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when it's mainly travelers from the Arabian Peninsula. And as under the Khulafa, the Islamic lands are expanding at a frightening pace, right? And Hajj is becoming very, very international very early on. And from the time of Muawiyah, who's based, of course, in Sham, we already have some kind of what we'd call a Hajj caravan. And actually, the idea of a Hajj caravan lasts kind of all the way into the 19th century. I think the last one, off the top of my head, I'm not sure when it would have been, but kind of very late on. And certainly when the Suez Canal opens in 1869, it changes a lot about and the way pilgrims are traveling. But so if we take those 2 points, in between, the land Hajj journey is massively important. Okay, or we might mark off steamships as a kind of an important juncture in Hajj history. So in between those 2 points, Hajj, the overland travel is extremely important, right? And now we've kind of come back full circle where the journey is not important at all. It's just a flight. And that actually takes away the anticipation, if you like. So I just wrote an article, which hopefully will be published. Academia is slow, so probably like in 5 years, or hopefully 5 months, where I talk initially about how the land journey influences the way people are approaching the city and the kind of anticipation they have. And it makes that first look at the Kaaba or at the Prophet's dome kind of pregnant with intense emotionality. And you kind of think, can that really be resembled in the modern age?
We've got so many images that people have on their phones, and you know, there's Stream to Us and all those kind of things. So it absolutely is that we don't have that anticipation.
Yeah. I mean, I look at how images of the haramain evolved in the period that I look at, which was like 17th century. And I think it's only then that you really start to see a lot of images, but still, obviously, not on the scale that we have now, where you're talking about smartphones. You can even watch the Hajj live on TV if you want, you know. So I think that kind of level of yearning, which actually Imam Ghazali is one of the first things he talks about when he talks about the different internal states that people should have on the Hajj. He begins with the idea of yearning for the haramain. And I think, but that also gives me hope, because I'm not a theologian, and I think our modern theologians need to pick up the Hajj challenge and think about articulating a modern theology for the Hajj. But Ghazali is a good place to start, because he talks about the different internal states that you should have at different points of the pilgrimage. And I think those are timeless points that he makes. So he talks about how pilgrims, it's better to go on foot. But he says, if you're a rich person and you're miserly, you should get a mount, because you're not going on foot to kind of be humble or to have a more authentic experience. You're just trying to save your money. So there's points like that, but going on foot. So now, when we look at the modern Hajj, there is really no point in having motorized travel, because it takes longer. So that is one easy way. Just get rid of motorized transport, except for people who need it. So like elderly and disabled. So that's one point he talks about. He talks about also modesty and simplicity of transport. In his context, that meant not having litters, or what you'd call palanquins that you'd place on top of camels and then sit inside them. So he talked about that kind of thing. Modesty in dress, being shabby in dress and appearance, especially so before coming out of ihram, where you can kind of have that moment of cleansing, where you cut your hair and your nails and you use perfume and use soap. So he talks about how pilgrims should spend their money and not be worried about the physical impact that has on their, what you could call now, their bank balance. He talks about how people should behave after they've returned from the Hajj. And the reason I mention all these things is because those are timeless lessons, and they give us hope for how we should think about experiencing the Hajj today. And we didn't really talk about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his farewell Hajj. But I guess that's where we need to go back to, and we need to go back to the things he said, like man hajja walam yarfath walam yarfuth walam yafsuq raja'a ka yawmin waladatu ummuh. So if you go on the Hajj and you don't kind of commit obscenity and you don't quarrel with people, then you return home as if a newborn babe, so like free of sin. And the other al-umrah ila al-umrah kaffara lima baynahuma. So from one umrah to one umrah is an expiation for the sins that have occurred in between them. And also going back to the Quran and what the Quran emphasizes about the haram and about the signs. The Quran talks about signs, ayatun bayinat, so the clear signs that are supposed to be in the haram. So I think we need to go back to that and think about focusing on how to keep that alive for our generation and the next generation. So I think, what else are we talking about?
I was gonna say, how easy is it to do that? Because I think the reality, I mean, and again, this is on, I suppose, and also the group leaders as well, because I think one of the other things I remember, we were talking about when we went on Umrah last year with the Karima Foundation. We actually went to Medina first, and then we were on our way to Mecca, and we got there very late in the evening. Actually, it's quite late at night, and we decided we would do the Umrah then. And some people actually decided they would do it the next day. They were so tired and whatnot. But I remember one of the very first things that our group leader said was, everyone put away your phones. Like, I do not want to see a phone anywhere, because there were lots of people that was, people are so excited, and actually that's the tendency of our time is, I'm so excited, I need to take a picture, I need to show the video of me going around doing tawaf, and I've seen what are those like little hoverboard things? I've seen people going around hoverboard, Segway type things, and it's just a bit of a, and then obviously there's the selfies and everything else as well. So it's quite, and that's the challenge, isn't it? That the challenge is to take the modernity out of that experience, to try and
modernity. I think you touched on a really important point, which is what we should do personally to affect our experience and to maybe cleanse our experience. Maybe part of that is not going on your phone. I mean, you went last year, you probably noticed the selfies and people just blatant disrespect. Yeah, just they're on their phones as well. Yeah, the video
live video calling their friends and
the Prophet.
Yeah, we had someone who there was a family who was they were live chatting, whatever it is, Facebook chatting or whatever. Their family back home. It was a husband and wife and 2 children, and they actually lost the daughter. And the mum was going around showing it, and I saw the daughter, and I was just kind of like, okay, I can see your mum and dad, don't worry. And she was just freaking out, so I just held her up, and then they kind of saw, and they're like, oh my god, blah blah blah. But I was like, this is the things people do. Just, it's so easy to get lost. There are so many challenges, and I think, but it's a problem of modernity. I do feel like that, and I do feel like those are just challenges that Muslims have. Like lots of Muslims are going like, oh my god, I can't wait, SubhanAllah, it's going to be so exciting. I'm going to have halal McDonalds, halal and whatever else. And it's like people do get excited about those things.
Well, that's one easy way, of course, maybe to shut those kind of operations down. Very simple point. You can take out the maqams of the madahib from around the Kaaba. Fair enough. But then why erect a massive clock tower overshadowing the Kaaba? That will make people very dubious about your intentions for removing the maqams of the madahib and of removing the initially the dome structure and then the underground entry to the Zamzam well, and then everything else that you're doing with destroying mountains. And I mean, the Safa Marwa thing you alluded to earlier, was there really a need to kind of reduce them down and to place them under glass like that, especially when the Quran says that they're the sha'air inna Safa wal Marwa min sha'airillah. Yeah. So things like that make people very dubious even about necessary renovations and expansions that have to be made. And also now, is there really a need to try and fleece pilgrims as part of their new master plan for making the Hajj a tourist enterprise? I think all of these questions are much easier to answer than the earlier questions we made about expansions.
I mean, I would also say as well, one of the other things I do think is that, and I have heard people talking about, again, when we went, is, people are paying, I mean, I don't know what Hajj is now, what, 5-6 grand from the UK plus? And then so when they're paying that much, people are saying, I want the full service, I want the full whack, I want, when we actually went last year, we went, my father went as well. And he actually went to Hajj in sort of mid-70s. So he was sort of, when we were on the coaches, and he was saying, oh, well, obviously that wasn't there. And, they didn't have hotels. So they were staying at, so-and-so. There was a place actually where I think he said all the Indians were staying, or the Pakistani Indians were staying, that was near Medina. And he's like, obviously that place isn't there anymore. And obviously the people were packed to the rafters and all those kind of things as well. But he actually recalled his experience in Mina when he went, which again, people talk about, oh, subhanAllah, it's Mina, it's this tent city. But now you go and there's like actually the tents are air conditioned units. So, they're a canvas tent, but they're air conditioned, and you've got bunk beds and whatever, maybe not bunk beds, but you've definitely got mattressy type things there. But he recalled, actually, he said that you had to have all your food with you. So he, for days, he just had a handful of apples, and that was it. But when I went, there were people that were complaining that there wasn't enough food.
Yeah.
And I was like, subhanAllah, yeah, exactly. People were saying, I've only got one, kebab roll in mine. I wanted 2 in Mina, and I paid my money for it, man. Come on, sort it out.
On that note,
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
So in terms of this once upon a time, Hajj is always seen as this. I don't know if Iqbal's got this line where he talks about the haram, right next to each other is Mahmud and Ayaz. Mahmud Ghaznavi is right next to his servant, and they're both praying to Allah together. This egalitarian nature of Islam, where it's sort of the great equalizer. The Hajj comes, you all put on the ihram, and now suddenly, and I really wanted to bring up, because the most famous Hajj account we have, Ibn Battuta, Ibn Jubayr, and they're very, and all those accounts. But for the Western Muslim, there's nothing that stands out more than the account Malcolm X.
Yeah.
When he went on Hajj and he saw what he saw and the experience that he had, and the mindset he went with was maybe a different mindset. He was a political individual who came with a thought process already in mind, and he saw this sort of, the white. He called them the white man. He's basically like Syrian Arabs or something, and the black man eating together from the same cup, and it was such a transformational moment for him. But at the same time, you think now, like what Asim's saying is the Hajj as egalitarian as not, like as society becomes more unequal in the real world, the Hajj sort of symbolizes that too. Because I remember when we went in the Haram, Asim, do you remember there were people who didn't even have like hotels to stay at? They were sleeping, they were like homeless Hujjaj, homeless pilgrims who were just sleeping on the floor, whereas we're in, I don't want to bash ourselves too much, but we're living in a life of luxury that we don't even experience in the UK probably. So it was like, how egalitarian was the Hajj seen earlier in the more pre-modern times? Has it been as egalitarian as people have always made it out to be?
One of the things, just to say very quickly before you answer that, actually, in terms of what we experienced, is the hotel had breakfast. So we had obviously a buffet breakfast, and they had a sign to say, "Don't eat too much. Make sure you don't eat too much." Because I was like,
it's full of Gulf Arabs, to be honest. It makes sense.
Yeah. we've touched on so many important things. Firstly, the sense of personal responsibility. So while I do charge modern theologians and scholars with, as I said, articulating that modern theology of the Hajj, I think we all need to take personal responsibility and get out of that McDonald's mindset, where we're going for Umrah and we're going for fillet of fish. So we need to get rid of the fillet of fish aspect of Umrah.
Halal Big Mac, fillet of fish you can have here.
I mean, that's like 20 years ago. Now it's like Shake Shack and all that kind of thing, right? So I need to get with the program. And 5 lads and 5 Hujjaj. That's my one. So that sense of personal responsibility, plus if you're gonna go for like a absolute luxury Hajj package, you're buying into what's happening, and you're contributing to the Saudi, I'd say, not imagination, but the Saudi, what they've conceived, their conception of the Hajj and of what the modern Hajj should look like. And
it's a dream, isn't it? It's their dream of it, what it should be.
Or the nightmare.
Yeah.
It's their vision, isn't it? It's that whole 2030 vision. That's their vision.
Yeah, that is their vision. So, and that vision leaves a lot less room for what we talked about, things like equality. Ghazali was only talking about transport when he was talking about equality and clothing, and it's gone way beyond that now. On the food point, I see when I look at old Hajj guides, so I always look at old guides to how to the Hajj. They're called Kitab al-Manasik. So many historic types of Kitab al-Manasik, and they always say the same point about eating. Don't eat too much, just eat enough to keep yourself going, especially on Arafah. Whereas now on Arafah, you get a main meal. It's just like, I mean, what is going on with that? But again, just because you have a main meal doesn't mean that you should ask for double the food. Maybe we should all take personal responsibility in eating less. And if you have left over, there's lots and lots of less privileged people than us, as you alluded to, people whose hotels are so far away that they sleep by the gates of the haram so that they can be present for all the salah, right? And I guess maybe that tells us that we're talking from a place of privilege as well, where just because we're enjoying the luxuries, there's many people, probably from the same countries I mentioned earlier, like from the subcontinent especially, who are having a very, very different engagement with the haramain than we are. And I think that brings me on to the point of equality. And that's another place where, I mean, the Malcolm X experience, it's incredible how much things have changed between Malcolm X and us. Much of that is still present. So you can definitely have moments, Malcolm X type moments, like when I reflect myself, Salatul Jumu'ah, normally you go like 3 hours before, right? So you can get a good place. And then you just sit next to maybe your friends, but I've sat alone in the past when I've been there, and you sit next to a person from one country and a person from another country. And I remember there was a Pakistani uncle I was sitting next to, and it seems crazy now, but he gave me some water that he had in his bag. In the era of COVID, you'd have to say no to that. But yeah, so like stuff like that. There's definitely room for that. But you'd have to say what places are left where you can experience that.
In terms of that equality thing,
Hajj.
in terms of the equality thing, like, would that be a traditional thing? Would you see, you read about the Sahaba, Ridwanullah alayhim ajma'in, say that Umar is making Hajj with everybody else. Now, obviously, the Haram gets closed off just so, I don't know, there was some famous singer, I can't remember her name, who came from Egypt, and everybody's like, look, she's here and she needs to go in, and she's been given like an army entourage that makes sure nothing happens. But was, like in Ottoman times and those times, would the Hajj have been this egalitarian paradise that we're making out to be, or are we being too utopian at the same time?
I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. Even if you look at, so the first photographs of the Hajj are from about 1880 onwards. If you look at the plain of Arafah, it is the plain of Arafah. It's not what we recognize now. It's just a plain. There's, of course, the mountain, and there's people are just camped there. Everyone looks more or less the same. People have their mounts with them, and they have their kind of baggage and kind of rough bags. Kind of like Muzdalifah now, actually. Muzdalifah now is one of the few places where you can feel that, where you can get a semblance of that, where everyone's kind of just, there's no tents in sight. You're kind of under the open sky, and men are still in ihram at that point. So that is one of the few places. Whereas Arafat now is not really a plain. It's not really a maidan, if you like. So when I see my scholars that I read from the past, and the way they would constantly, in their theological interpretation of the Hajj, immediately connect the Maidan of Arafat with the day of resurrection, and where people would be on a similar plane. Some people said it was going to be Arafat. I think there's less evidence for that, but I'm not sure. But people are similarly gathered, waiting for judgment. So that kind of connection that could be made at that time, and they made that connection not only because people were all in ihram, in white cloth, which has definite like connections to like a shroud, but also because people are equal and they're all just focused on their accounts. And I think because Arafah is also now kind of like a tent city, just as Mina is. I disagree on this because you guys have been too.
Yeah,
I think there's less of that. Whereas Muzdalifah is one of the few places left where you can have a connection. And from what I read of the Ottoman period, I don't really see the levels of inequality that we see today. So I mainly read who I can, which is learned people who are inclined to write about their experiences, often religious scholars, and if not religious scholars, then kind of semi-professional travelers, like Evliya Çelebi is quite a famous person, Ottoman traveler. He considered himself a world traveler. So people like him. So they're naturally more likely to have more privileged experiences. For example, a scholar is immediately part of a scholarly community, so he can go and usually they did this before they even went to the haramain. They'd get in touch with a local scholar and say, can I stay with you, etc. And then once they got there, they'd be introduced to the local leadership. So their experience is always going to be different to the experience of the everyday pilgrim. And there's the issues that Imam Ghazali touched upon, which is that some people were traveling in elaborate palanquins, in litters, where they could kind of chill inside while their camels walking along. And some people are on foot. Some pilgrims are very poor and relying on the charity of others. But in terms of the Hajj itself, I think there was still very much the kind of Malcolm X type equality where during the days of Hajj, people were kind of reduced to being pilgrims. Whereas now we see, like in Mina, it would be different if all tents were the same, but they're not. Some tents are luxury tents, some tents are carpeted, some people are doing barbecues, and some people are doing Subway, and some people are, like your father was, eating apples and mixed nuts and things like that.
I think it's also a case of how people are treated by those responsible in the area, just to, by the Saudis and, by the police and whatever else as well, because that also gives a feeling for that sense of equality, or whether it's equality or not really. So my experience actually when I went, and I remember being it was in Makkah, it was a Jummah, and so I'd managed to get there, hours and hours before, trying to find a space as close as I possibly could. And then I remember the police officer, he's come down, he's kicking people out of the way, shouting and screaming at people and moving them out of the way. And this old Pakistani guy comes in. He sits right on that corner, right on the edge of the row. And then the police officer comes, gives him, you know, hits him and just tells him to move on, right, get out of here, do one. And then I sort of saw the space open up and I thought, oh, I'll be cheeky. So I just went and quickly sat in his space while the police officer turned around. So he's turned around now, he's seen me in that space that he's just kicked someone else out of, and he's come over to me, he's like shouting, screaming at me. And he's gone, Pakistani, Pakistani. I was like, no, mate, I'm British. And he said, Britannia, Britannia. He's like, okay, it's fine, you can stay here. And I was like, wow, that's...
Yeah.
I mean,
bless the Queen.
That's what I mean. Yeah, God bless the Queen. But that's actually what I mean in terms of that. And I mean, it just reminded me when you said taking personal responsibility. I mean, I was using my position of privilege definitely as a Brit just to go, wow, I'm going to get as close as I can. Whereas a Pakistani, unfortunately, he was kicked out and I don't know where he got to.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment we have, along with the issues around, you know, the renewal of the holy city, that's too fast-paced and it has sacrificed the local religious, social, cultural, historical fabric. We also have an issue with religious hierarchies and with cultural hierarchies. So where certain brands of Islam are seen as superior, certain schools of thought, certain schools of theology, but also certain cultures are seen as superior. And it's the total antithesis to actually, ironically, the farewell Hajj and the Prophet, peace be upon him, sermon and his message on exactly those points, and the famous lines, you know, no Arab is superior to non-Arab, no non-Arab is superior to an Arab, no black is superior to a white, and no white is superior to a black, except by taqwa. So I think there's a need, as part of the spiritual revival in the haramain, I think that is a very, very important part of it, you know, and inshallah it will come in our lifetime as well.
Just to, because you mentioned this idea of equality. So recently, I don't know if it was a couple of years ago, there was obviously with the whole rise of the hashtag #MeToo movement, there were people bringing up the Hajj as a sort of place where, in the modern Hajj at the very least, and because maybe the size of the crowds and stuff, there was, I don't want to dwell on this specific point too much, but I'm going to use it as a segue. But it's like the idea that there were abuses taking place and women weren't given prominence in the place of Hajj, always recommended within the Hajj guides as women stay back, stay with your male, you know, the mahram, etc., and things like that. So I thought it'd be nice to maybe open up to the idea of the traditional woman's role or the female role within the Hajj, because I assume as with the men making the Hajj, the women, I don't know if they would come in the same numbers that the men would, but I'm assuming the women would also make, because the famous hadith of the Rasul alayhi wasallam, that jihadu kunna al-Hajj, that your jihad is Hajj, that he said to say that Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he said also for the cowardly man, his jihad is also Hajj, but I don't want people to draw parallels to that. But anyways, but that's the statement that the Prophet said, that the jihad of the women is Hajj, and so they would go. So I'm assuming they did used to go, and at the same time we have all these records of, like you mentioned, was it Darb Zubaydah, and I think that's very interesting as a point as well, that a lot of the philanthropy that happened on the Hajj route and looking after the Hujjaj, and a lot of the sort of systems that were set up by women who would look after the Hujjaj. So would women go on Hajj in the same way that men would go, and how were they seen there, and would they see themselves as like some sort of inferiority that we're not allowed to do to the more public degree that men can, the same sort of rites and rituals and things like that?
So all very important points. We can separate. We can make two broad strands of this. We can talk about female patronage, including Zubaydah, and then we can talk about the everyday female pilgrim across time. And to start with Zubaydah and Harun al-Rashid, two very, very important kind of early personalities who are kind of the pinnacle when it comes to, certainly until the Ottoman period, they were seen as the kind of
power couple
archetype. Sorry?
Oh, they're like a power couple.
The ultimate power couple. Yeah. I mean, the reason I bring that up is because the kind of patronage that was kind of occurring during their time in the haramain is kind of unmatched. It's fair to say subsequently, and so for example, Harun al-Rashid, he personally did the Hajj 9 times. Okay, so that is a very significant.
Very rare for a Muslim ruler to do Hajj, right?
Well, he was the last Abbasid one to do it. So that can, and then it's not long after that the problems that I alluded to. So like the Carmathians or Carmatians, and sounds like Carnation, the Qaramita, and before them there was also a massacre at Arafat a few years before that. So the Abbasids not long after become kind of unable to protect the Haramain. But going back to Harun and Zubaydah, Zubaydah bin Ja'far, who died in 831, and Harun al-Rashid, she outlived Harun, who died in 809, and she did the Hajj 3 times herself, if I'm correct. And she didn't personally build the Darb Zubaydah, which is this, hundreds of kilometers of the overland route linking Iraq to the Haramain. So from Baghdad and Kufa, an overland network of reservoirs and cisterns. So water is very important, because along that route there were only about 1 or 2 natural oases. So it is a massive. It was a feat of engineering on the part of the Abbasids, not seen since the Romans, where they kind of, all these manazil or way stations where pilgrims can stop and get their food and drink. And also they had Barid, which was a kind of old postage system, initially set up by Muawiyah. So they had a Barid system where you could see directions on posts that were kind of placed there. There were manar, which were kind of fire kind of structures for when you were traveling by night. They would light up the way.
Like Lord of the Rings.
I think so. I mean, I've seen
the beacons of Minas Tirith have been lit. No.
Which one?
When they light the beacons, so they know that the army's been attacked.
Yes. Beacons of Minas Tirith are lit.
Just to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So
Rohan will answer.
Rohan will answer. What a moment.
Yes, moving forward. So King Theoden, I wonder how he would have maybe organized the Hajj. Anyway, coming back to, so, Walhasil, in conclusion, this is a massive network, which is very, very impressive. And the reason we call it Darb Zubaydah is because out of all the different Khalifs and patrons of this network, she was at the forefront. And it was actually Harun's mother, Khayzuran, who converted the house of Khadija, which, as I said, Fatima radiallahu anha was born in, and which the Prophet lived in for many years prior to his hijrah. She actually converted that, purchased it and converted it into a mosque. So we can see from those early Abbasid female personalities, ruling personalities, the idea of patronizing not only the Hajj journey, which I explained was important for the most part of the history of the Hajj, but also actual locations in the Haramain itself. And if we fast forward to the Mamluks, and we see Mamluk royal women undertaking the Hajj as well. Same in the Ottomans. In fact, an Ottoman, one of the Sultan's sisters lost her life in the 1700s when there was a Bedouin attack on one of the caravans. So even if Ottoman sultans were unable to personally undertake the Hajj because of the risks that carried, them leaving their seat of power, it would take perhaps 45 days or so to Istanbul to Damascus, or the specific place in Istanbul is modern day Üsküdar. That took about 37 days plus 6 days of resting. and Damascus to Medina, because they would first go to Medina, the Damascus caravan, that took about 35 days, then 10 more days to Mecca. So you can do the math. And then obviously the time of Hajj and then the return journey. So the Shaykh al-Islams and the ulama in that time gave permission to the Sultan to deputize someone to do the Hajj on his behalf. And that's of course one of the unique features of the Hajj, that it can be proxied by someone else. But the Ottoman women, as I said, would undertake the Hajj. But beyond that, they were very careful to, I just need to plug my charger in. What they did was, the Darb Zubaydah, they actually focused on renewing parts of that network that was still in existence. So some of her work that she did in terms of the water infrastructure in and around Mecca itself, they actually paid for the refurbishment of that. So they were like literally following in her path. So, you know, we're talking about a massive few hundreds of years in between. But this is why I say that they were the archetype of Hajj patrons, because of like the respect that people had for what they did. So the people who engaged in this were Sultan's wives or their favorites, which was Haseki Sultan. So from the Sultan's women, the literal favorite comes from Khaski. So Khas, the Sultan's favorite, normally would then later on become a Valida Sultan, so the mother of the next Sultan. So these personalities especially were involved in kind of funding foundations, so waqfs, awqaf, to fund particular activities in the haramain. They funded hospices, public kitchens, all types of different buildings in the haramain. And as I also mentioned, they financed waterworks and also madaris and maintaining masajid in the haramain as well. And as for ordinary lay female pilgrims, undoubtedly they undertook the Hajj, and the fate and the level of security and safety of the Hajj caravan is very much tied to the ruler and the way they're managing the Hajj. So the more safe it is, the more possibilities that female pilgrims would have had to undertake the Hajj. And once they were there, things were changing all the time. So I know that there's a chapter someone's written out there on female mosque access in Mecca in the 16th century. I think Keisha Ali has written on that. Was it Marion Katz? Anyway, so you can follow that up. I remember looking at Joseph Pitts, who did the Hajj in 1685.
He was a Muslim, right?
Sorry?
He was a Muslim, right, Joseph Pitts?
Joseph Pitts, at the time he was, and then he escaped. So he was from Exeter. When he was about 17 or so, some pirates kind of captured him. I think he was a fisherman or a kind of merchant seaman, and he was kind of captured and taken to Algiers. And his first master was kind of very cruel to him, sold him on to someone else, and his second master, according to Pitts, converted him forcibly. But then he was sold on to a third patron who was quite an elderly person and who basically looked after him like a son and said, you know, stay with me and I'm going to leave all my stuff to you. And he actually took Joseph Pitts on the Hajj with him with the intention of freeing him there so that his Hajj would be valid as well. Because of course we know one of the conditions for Hajj is to be free. And his master almost died on the way. So he actually was about to give him his freedom papers, establishing that he was no longer a slave, but he survived and they made it to Mecca. But then Pitts escaped back to Exeter and renounced Islam and wrote a whole book about Islam and about his time in Algiers. So yeah, I'd recommend people to read it. It's very, very interesting. He talks about the Hajj, he talks about life in Algiers, he talks about what food they eat there, all very fascinating. And he may have genuinely been a Muslim at that time, because if he was, he would not have been able to say it in his book, because the people around him would have said, how could you have converted to Islam? The whole reason he wrote that book was to establish that he hadn't converted to Islam. So he was more interested in kind of exposing Islam, if you like. But because he's so honest, you can approach him as a source and actually benefit from what he's writing, because it's not as if he's kind of trying to hide anything in that sense. Coming back to the point, he observes that when the female pilgrims are circling the Kaaba, the men then kind of draw back and form an outer ring. So there's a sense of boundary and respect there. And they kind of shared access to the Hajar al-Aswad. And on one day, men were allowed to physically enter the Kaaba, but that privilege was also given to women on another appointed day, separately. So in his time, women were enjoying very good access to the Kaaba and to the area of Tawaf. But I know that some later modern accounts paint a less favorable picture, and they say that some of those accesses had been restricted. But certainly there's female involvement throughout the history of the Hajj.
I have a memory of, like, say, that Aisha radiallahu anha. I double check this. There's a time when only the women would go in and do tawaf in the time of the Sahaba ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in as well, which I'm going to double check that one just to be sure, but I have a memory of reading it recently. But then at the same time, I don't see how that's very difficult to sort of enforce that in the modern age, but I could see that happening in pre-modern.
It might be difficult to enforce, but we need to make sure we don't go to the other extreme.
Of completely excluding them.
Talk to any women about, for example, their access to the ziyarah of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the kind of difficulties they go through there, where they have an appointed time, I believe, but it's like really cramped and people are pushing, and like the stronger nationalities or ethnicities win out. So I'm like Gujarati, so Gujarati women are probably less strong than, I'm not going to mention any of the strong nationalities in case I'm accused of being but I'm saying the women of my own nationality are quite weak. So
I hope will your mum be watching this?
Yeah, my mum will prove that she isn't when she slaps me later for saying but yeah, I mean, my mum's, I think, quite strong, and she was helping other people in the group out. So it's about maintaining a good balance according to what's appropriate today, and to make sure that we're being fair.
Just to finish off, really, I'd love to, because I know you wanted to mention the farewell Hajj of the Prophet ﷺ a couple of times. It's sort of come up, alluded to. I mean, in terms of that is the archetypal Hajj. That was a Hajj the Prophet ﷺ did near the end of his life, after the great sacrifices that the Sahaba made, the development that he undertook of Islam as the deen that it is, and of the Sahaba ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in, this monumental task. I think 100,000 companions joined him, Salalahu Alayhi Wasallam, in this amazing Hajj experience. And obviously those accounts of all the Sahaba who were there, who experienced it, what they went through, what they saw, the likes of Ibn Abbas and others who saw with such great vivid detail the experience of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and how he was the centerpiece of the Sahaba in the Hajj himself, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But again, as this sort of the great spiritual, how would you put it? Like the spirit of the Hajj is the Hajj of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and those early pilgrimages that took place with the Sahaba. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu led, I think, a Hajj campaign and stuff like that. I mean, you've talked about revival. We need to sort of bring back the Hajj of that age, and it's not like a very sort. I hope it's not like a Salafi revivalist idea where it's like trying to enforce 6th, 7th century norms on 21st century world, which doesn't work. But at the same time, like a spiritual revival of a prophetic Hajj that can still take place. I'd love to get some closing thoughts on that, inshallah.
Yeah, on that last point you said, I agree. So like we always cite the example of women being behind the men in the Prophet's mosque, And I always say we need more detail on how to actually carry the spirit of that into the modern age, because that's a very easy cop out to say that that's how it was in the Prophet, peace be upon his time, and we all know that. But the challenge, as you say, is conveying the spirit of that and articulating it. So I know in the new Cambridge Mosque, even though I study in Cambridge, I haven't been to it yet. I'm really embarrassed to say that, because I thought when it's going to be summer, I can take my wife and we can have a proper day out, and I can take her with me. And this has happened. There are a lot of things I said I'd do in the summer.
Perfect excuse to not do loads of things then.
Sorry?
Perfect excuse then, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would have done it, but you know.
COVID, we don't want to die.
So like I know in the Cambridge Mosque, they have really thought about that and about women's access, you know, and that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Not that I'm anyone to be looking for things, but I mean, I really respect what they did there. They've made different types of spaces. They've made it a very versatile space. So like I believe barriers can be moved and lifted, and they've tried to cater for men and women and families, so children, and that's very important as well. So isn't it cool that we can look for inspiration in Cambridge, you know, where we might not find one in a place where we should be looking for it in an ideal world, a place like Medina, which is, you know, so close to our hearts as Muslims, and it always has been. Back to the question. I mean, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, said "Khudh anni manasikakum" in that monumental farewell Hajj, which is only like, you know, probably less than 3 months, and he passes away. He kind of established the Hajj, the blueprint of the Hajj, as a very diverse, different, ritually diverse, spatially diverse, just a different form of worship to what we're used to. Very
Would you
different.
translate "Khudh anni manasikakum"? Would you maybe translate?
Take from me, learn from me your rituals, your Hajj rituals. Sorry about that. So when he said that, he established the Hajj as a very, as I said, ritually and spatially diverse. So it's different types of things that you're doing. You're doing Ramyul Jamarat, you're pelting the shaitan. You're doing sacrifices. Your tawaf of the Kaaba, sa'i, running between Safa and Marwa. There's the wuquf at Arafah, the standing at Arafah. There's the mabit in Mina, so you're spending the in Muzdalifah and in Mina, so you're spending the night in those places as well. So and this is all happening in different places, and that will never change, you know, bi'idhnillah, with the permission of Allah. That will never change. It will always be ritual, diverse in that respect. The question is, how will the boundaries of that diversity change? You know, so how will the space around all those and the character of those rituals change? And I think that's what we need to think about. We need to think about how, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, came in, how the Hajj was, how the Quraysh were refusing to even go to Arafat because they thought, you know, we're too special to exit the Haram. We won't go to Arafat. There was idol worship occurring, and why did Allah choose that time to reveal the verse about Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, I've perfected your religion for you today? Why did he choose for the Prophet to deliver the farewell sermon, which has kind of come down to us and has so many pertinent lessons? So I think really it's about reconnecting with that prophetic Hajj, and that's a challenge really which we all have to undertake. So it's about our individual responsibility and approach to the Hajj, and of course it's about the authorities. It's about the agents in this country who are, you know, administering the Hajj. It's about all of us at different levels really. So even now I'm hearing about dishonest agents and how people are trying to get their money back who've paid for the Hajj. So I guess it's not enough for us to just put everything at Saudi's door, but it's also about all of us taking responsibility as well. So that, I guess that's a nice closing message.
I was going to say, but I think it's important. It's such an important closing message because we can take that well, into our daily lives, not just in the Hajj, which is obviously the idea of that farewell message. So inshallah. So again, thank you so much for your time. I think we've been through a whistle-stop tour of the Hajj, and I think loads of really, really important points that we've gone through there. Can you just very quickly, just to finish off on to the Yahya, just talk about some of the, I don't know, if people wanted to find out more information, where might they, I mean, is there a digital copy somewhere of that National Geographic?
And also, Sidi Yahya did some lectures for the Fatima Elizabeth.
Okay, yes.
That word, Prince Trinity, whatever. That maybe he can link us and tell us.
Yes. So if you send that to us, what we do is we can put that in the descriptions bit below as well.
I've actually got 2 of these. So this one's on PDF everywhere, 53. The 37 edition is less well known. I think I'll scan that and put that out there for everyone. And I'll make some other recommendations, textbooks, and the Ghazali stuff example is translated too. So, yeah, I'll give a really, inshallah, juicy reading list for everyone.
Brilliant. That'll add to the reading list for so many other guests that we've had on. So again, thank you so much for your time, Jazakallah khair, and good luck with the completion of your PhD, inshallah, soon. Hope everything goes well, inshallah.
Well, Jazakallah khair for having me and for inviting me and letting me ramble on for 2 hours. And I'm sorry. I'm sure you have a headache from my voice after all that.
Super fascinating, super interesting. And then again, just a reminder for everybody, please do like, share, subscribe. Are there any comments below? All those kind of things. It will be available on all the usual platforms as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.